Hello, PodB students. This is Miss Buckingham, and today we are going to be talking about the business cycle and how the business cycle relates to economic health. So in this unit, we've been talking about economic indicators. So there's different things that we can look at to determine the health of an economy, whether it's growing and expanding or it's in decline or contraction. So far we have talked about the GDP, we have talked about unemployment and inflation. Today we're going to talk about the business cycle. So what the business cycle is basically a recurring pattern of growth and decline in economic activity over time. So all economies experience this growth and decline. Different periods, they vary. There's no real way to predict how long these different phases are going to be, the phases of growth or the phases of decline or the different turning points, which we'll look at a little bit later when we look at the actual graph. So there's no specific way to tell us when we're going to be moving into an expansion or contraction, or how long the peak is going to last or the trough, but we still look to this business cycle to give us an idea of those turning points and what's going to happen next. And it's going to help us examine and sort of analyze and evaluate an economy over a period of time. So it'll make more sense when we look at this graph. And I would ask that in your notes, wherever you're taking notes, that you create this graph. This graph is from your textbook. It's on page 259 in your textbook. We are looking at chapter 13, section 4 currently on the business cycle, and this graph is directly from there. So this graph is going to show you what this looks like, this business cycle. So if we're monitoring economic activity and we're looking at these different phases, these are the 4 different phases that we would look to see what's going on in the economy during this time. And when we're in these different phases of contraction, expansion, contraction, and expansion, and it continues over time, and sometimes the length of the contraction or the length of the expansion or the length that we sit at a peak or at a trough is going to be different depending on what's going on in the world at that time. There's no necessarily perfect amount of time, whether this is going to go on for a year or months or a decade, but it depends on all the other factors of the world. But these are the 4 phases that we would be looking at, and we'll talk about each of them individually. And then we'll talk about what's going on with GDP and inflation and unemployment during these time periods, okay? So typically that business cycle, again, is that recurring pattern of change as an economy expands and contracts, During that expansion, economic activity is going to increase. So you can see it sort of growing. Think of it like a roller coaster, right? You're going up the hill of the roller coaster till you hit that crescent, that top, that peak. The peak is going to be really the end of expansion, right? It's the best that the expansion is going to get, and we're going to head into contraction from that point. The economy is going to shrink or decline, and it's going to slow down until it sort of bottoms out, and we come to the bottom of that hill. Times are going to be rough in here potentially. We're not going to have a lot of productivity. We might have high rates of unemployment. And then again, something's going to trigger an expansion and the economy starts to grow and build again until it comes to that peak. So we'll kind of break down the definitions and then talk about what does that look like for those other economic indicators that we've talked about so far. So expansion. The period of economic growth would be expansion. Okay, so during this phase of the business cycle, economic activity is going to generally increase from month to month. Probably one of the longest expansions of the U.S. economy that we've seen had lasted over a decade, so 10 years or more. But typically we see the economy run out of steam in 3 to 5 years are typical, I guess you could say, amounts of expansion. But there's so many different factors now that impact the economy. It's becoming more and more difficult to predict. Again, the peak's going to be that highest point of expansion. or a period of economic growth. And again, though, that peak is going to lead right into the start of a decline of economic activity. And economists don't know when a peak is occurring until they look back at it. Okay, so at the time, they would designate kind of one particular month as a peak phase as they look back on economic data. We don't really know that it's the peak until after the peak has passed. Okay, if that makes sense. So what typically happens during expansion? When we're in that expansionary phase, what's happening to some of those other economic indicators? GDP would be up, right? We would see during an expansion period, we have the economy growing. So we would see that those levels of real GDP growing as well. We've got products that are being created here, exported to other countries. There's a lot of buying and selling of goods and services going on. So GDP is high, is growing. Unemployment would be declining or going down. This means that because productivity is high, there are jobs. There's a lot of jobs. People are employed. People are actively working. So the unemployment rate during an expansion is typically low. And we would also see that inflation rate start to rise as people are buying things and we are productive, prices are going up. It's keeping people buying, and that inflation rate is increasing, hopefully slowly, so it doesn't become a problem. But again, expansion is a time of economic growth, so we're going to see productivity growing, unemployment going down, inflation starting to rise. So then we go into that, after we've hit that peak, remember we are starting to go down the hill again. So we're moving into contraction. So following the peak is going to come the contraction phase of the business cycle, and this is going to be general economic decline. And we would, again, we'll talk about it more in a second, but we're going to see that falling GDP, rising unemployment. The Great Depression is the longest contraction on record thus far. It was about 43 months long at the beginning of the Great Depression. Typically, since 1945, contractions have averaged about 10 months or more. When we had some problems in 2008, we saw a longer period of a recession, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. So remember, we've got that contraction phase, and then you've got the trough at the bottom, right? It's like it bottoms out. This is kind of the worst it's going to get. It's the lowest point of contraction or economic decline. And then from the trough, we start to build again, and we move back into that expansionary phase. So again, think of it kind of like that roller coaster, that up and down, expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. So what typically is going to happen during that contraction phase? Again, because it's a time of economic decline, you're going to see GDP falling. We are not buying as much. There's not as much going on. You're going to not see an increase in exports, or again, consumer confidence typically tends to be low during a contractionary phase because you can see the unemployment rate is rising. We have a lot of people or more people out of work or looking for jobs. There's not enough jobs to be had because productivity is low. So there's not as much income and money moving through the economy, which then causes that inflation rate to go down. Again, you think prices go down, that's a good thing. It is for a while, but we don't want prices to go too low. Otherwise, people tend to just sort of wait until they get lower, and then we, again, don't have the productivity or the spending that needs to happen to keep the economy going. So from boom to bust, we typically, it's kind of another way of referring to the business cycle is periods of boom and bust. So the boom is going to be that expansion phase. Sometimes it might be referred to as recovery or an upswing or a prosperous time, but essentially the economy is healthy and it's growing. Typically, how we know we've got a growing economy is we see an increase in business investment. So this means firms are investing in capital goods, so factories, machines, equipment, which leads to more productivity. People are creating things, making more things, manufacturing more things. So this increased productivity contributes to the rise of real GDP. And at that same time, if those firms are building factories and have more machinery and are doing more work, they're going to need more people. So we tend to see that unemployment rate go down, unemployment goes down because people are employed. The other thing that can contribute to growth is new resources. So as we discover new resources or we innovate in science and technology, it improves efficiency, increases productivity. Again, these are positive things that can stimulate an expansion. And again, consumer confidence is typically high because you've got jobs and businesses are profiting, wages are going up, the future's looking great, consumers are borrowing and spending money, especially on bigger ticket items. And that's when we are really in that boom phase, right? The economy is growing, it's thriving, everything's great. But even if an economic expansion goes on for years, inevitably it's going to bust. The bubble is going to burst, and that bust or the contraction phase is also referred to as a downturn or a recession. So a recession is a decline in economic activity that lasts at least 6 months. So it's going to be a longer period of time. You're going to see GDP falling, you're going to see wages going down, less employment, less profits, less production. And there's a lot of different things that could cause this, right? It's some type of negative shock to the economy. There's a stock market crash, rapidly rising oil prices, something that we're globally dependent on, terrorist activity, a pandemic. We are right in the middle or heading into that recessionary type of activity. What's happening right now in the world, or most recently in the world, is a shock to our economy. People weren't prepared for it. People weren't expecting it. It's causing a loss of jobs. People are out of work. People aren't spending as much money. Productivity is dramatically decreased. And it's going to be a prolonged period of time. We don't know if it's going to be a recession or if it's going to be more severe and be referred to as a depression. So a depression is going to be relatively rare. We feel like we've seen them more frequently over the last several decades, but typically this recession is going to be short. Okay, relatively mild in their effects. It happens 6 months. Depression is going to be a severe contraction. It's a prolonged economic downturn. We see plunging real GDP, extremely high unemployment. We have had several depressions. The Great Depression included 2008, we had a prolonged recession period of time after the housing market crash. This pandemic, the COVID-19 is looking to be moving in that direction. We're seeing a reduction in GDP. We're seeing higher rates of unemployment than we've seen in the last 10 years. And there's concerns there, right? But the good news is there is always recovery. What's going to trigger the recovery is sometimes unknown. It can be a variety of different events, but as business inventories shrink, firms will again begin to producing again, which means that will lead to innovative changes. New technologies might create new types of jobs. People will get back to work when they have their wages. Wages will increase. They'll have that money. They'll start spending over time, and you will move into that expansionary phase again. So these ups and downs of the business cycle are very, very real, and they might not seem real to you right now, but they will as you move into the job market. When you go to find a job post high school or post college, if you are looking for work during an expansion, you might find lots of job opportunity. If you're looking for a job during a recession, good jobs might be harder to find. And so as we move into the next section of this unit, we'll talk a little bit more about what's the government intervention. What can the government do to maybe move us into an expansionary phase more quickly or get us out of a contractionary phase more quickly. So there are things that the government can do to speed up and slow down the economy, and that's what we'll look at next time. Thanks for listening today.